Commissioners and staff of the PUCO, welcome to Phase 3 of Power Forward. This phase is entitled Ratemaking and Regulation. We are so grateful to those of you who are in the room and those of you who are watching at home, and especially grateful to our speakers who you'll see not only this week, but the week after next as well. This is going to be a 2-week portion, Phase 3 of Power Forward. We have, of course, the 3 days beginning today, and we'll also meet on March 20th through the 22nd. Let me just reflect for a moment about where we've been and what we plan on hearing today and where we plan on going. So we have to always remember with Power Forward, we began with just 2 very basic pillars. The underlying premise of Power Forward, that we hope to pair innovation with the concept of enhancing the customer electricity experience. These are the 2 pillars that have supported the proceeding from day one. We began this proceeding in a very organic fashion. In Phase 1, we discussed essentially the business case for Power Forward. We heard about changing consumer demographics. We about changing customer sentiments. We also learned about some of the amazing technology that exists today that could serve to better customers' lives. In Phase 2, we did a very deep dive into grid architecture. Initially, we had couched that phase as discussing the distribution system platform, but I think upon completion of that phase, when we really analyzed what we did in Phase 2, it was primarily a dive into grid architecture. We discussed the OT-IT convergence. We discussed grid architecture. We discussed the communications platform necessary to advance the modern grid. We discussed engineering particulars. And so we are a collection of economists, accountants, lawyers, and so doing that deep dive, I think, was necessary for us, again, in a linear fashion to proceed to where we are today. We took a very long pause between Phase 2 and Phase 3, and we did some self-study. And upon conducting that self-study, that is the agenda that you see today with respect to Phase 3. We initially called Phase 3 Ratemaking and Regulation. I think it has morphed into something bigger than that. So the first week of Power Forward Phase 3 will again be a discussion of, but really be the meat of that distribution system platform. We'll talk about distribution system planning. We'll talk about distribution system operations, distribution system markets. That will be this week. And then the following, it's actually the week after next, so again, March 20th through the 22nd, we'll get into the bones of economic regulation. We will discuss rate making and rate design, all within the context of grid modernization and grid modernization investments. All of this will culminate again in the PUCO publishing what we call a policy roadmap for the state with respect to grid modernization. We will not only include what we've learned here, of course, but we will also be prescriptive, EDU by EDU, about where the EDUs currently are, our electric distribution utilities, and what we'd like to see from them going forward. We are learning as this proceeding progresses. Again, I use the word linear a lot with Power Forward. We have not created a conclusion such as Power Forward should result in a 60% increase in distributed energy resources, or Power Forward should result in this type of marketplace. We began again with the very simple concepts of trying to pair innovation with bettering the lives of customers. And that's how we continue to proceed with this. We are learning as we are educated, and we are so grateful for that education from our speakers that have come in phases 1 and 2, and that we'll hear from in phase 3. With that, let me turn things over to Vice Chair Trombold, who will discuss some logistics for today. Beth has an eventful morning, so she not only is opening Power Forward with me right now, but she also has her Senate confirmation hearing for her reappointment, which we're all very pleased about. And that will take, Beth, what time do you have to leave here?
I will probably be stepping out about 9 o'clock, so please, panelists, I will watch you on the webcast later, but I'll come back as soon as I'm finished across the street.
We hope it will not be a long,
Yes.
some of us have experienced very long Senate confirmation hearings, so we hope it will not be a long, we'll hope you'll be back in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, Beth.
Okay. I just have a few announcements, mostly logistics for the day. And many of you have been here before, but for those of you that haven't, wanted to make sure you were aware that the Power Forward is webcast, and it's brought to us by Ohio Government Television. So we really thank them for that technology and allowing us with the opportunity to provide more viewing of our agenda. You can follow, we try to keep the webcast on according to the schedule. So, as much as possible, we're asking speakers to keep to their allotted time, and we have time cards that Christina Schaefer on the end there will be able to flash in case we're getting close to the time limits. Our Wi-Fi username is listed on that front on the monitors here, the Ohio guest and the password. We want to thank Live Technologies. They enhanced our audio-visual and our lighting so that the webcast can be viewed in a better way. There's a workroom right around the corner here in the hallway in case you need to step out during the conference and take a phone call or do some work. The webcast won't be available there, but you can have a quiet place to work if you need it. Restrooms are down the hall to the left, right down here. Social media, if you would like to talk about how the interesting dialogue we're having this week, please use hashtag PowerForwardOH. And be sure to tell everyone about, all your family and friends about what you're doing here. Just like in phase 1 and 2, we have breaks built in and a lunch on the agenda. Also this Thursday, we will be having our regularly scheduled commission meeting at 1:30. So it'll be on Thursday instead of Wednesday, so there'll be a little extra time at lunch, but we will begin Power Forward immediately after our commission meeting. Something new we added to phase 3 is the opportunity for audience members that are present here to ask questions. We have cards on the table over here by the door in a basket. If you would like to ask questions of any panelists, be sure to write them down, and we will have staff members collecting them at the end of each panel when the Q&A is being held. And if we have time, after the questions from the bench, we will be sure to take a look at those questions and perhaps ask some of them throughout the day. Let's see. I would be remiss if I didn't thank a lot of people who made today possible. We have 75 speakers coming over the course of the 2 weeks. It's been quite a big lift, and a small group has been responsible mainly for making this event the way it is today. So I'd like to thank these areas of the agency: the Office of Public Affairs, the Service Monitoring Enforcement Department, our Rates and Analysis Department, the Legal Department, and our Business Resources Department. All of them made today possible. Thank you to all the staff that worked really hard on that. I'd also like to recognize the folks here up at the bench. In addition to the commissioners and the chairman, we have our Chief of Policy, Howard Petrikoff, sitting next to the chairman. We have Dr. Hisham Shweki from our Federal Advocate, Department. And next to him, Mahala Christopher and Christina Schaefer, who's been very instrumental, and many of you have spoken with about the Power Forward proceeding, and we would be lost without all of her leadership. So thank you all. We will have, throughout the day and throughout Power Forward, various technical staff that are related to the issues we're covering, sitting at the bench as well and available to ask questions. I'd also like to thank all the commissioner aides. These are the folks that do a lot of things behind the scenes to help make all of us look so good. If you all could stand up. Kristen Klingen, stand up, please. She's been an unsung hero in getting this today scheduled. Keep standing, because I want to have all of them see the aides. Bethany Allen, she here. John Ryan, Rachel Maines, and Andy Schaefer. So these folks, if you have a question on one of the cards, be sure to hand it to one of them. They'll make sure it gets to the front. And I want to thank all of you because you all have done a really good job in making today possible. So thank you so very much. And I think that concludes. We can get started. And like I said, I will have to step out. Please don't take that as a lack of interest on my part because I certainly would love to be here. But hopefully I'll be back quickly. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again very much. And I do want to just very briefly single out Kristen Klingen, Christina Schaefer. Thank you very much for your very, very hard work. You both have just been absolute all-stars throughout all of this. So we are super grateful here at the agency. We could not have done it without the two of you and your leadership. So thank you very, very much. Also want to introduce the commissioners. So Chairman Asim Haque, Vice Chair Beth Trombold, Larry Friedemann, down here on my left, Tom Johnson on my right, and Dan Conway. And we already mentioned Chief Analyst Howard Petrikoff, who is here immediately at my right. Again, at the bench, Hisham Shweki, Mahila Christopher, Christina Schaefer. How we have been doing this is we allow for all of the presentations to occur, and then we ask questions of the panel in full. And as we ask those questions, it can be fielded by one or all three, and we may have specific questions for specific panelists. We are beginning Power Forward Phase 3. One thing I really wanted to do as we pushed into Phase 3 was again talk about vision for customers. We did some of that in Phase 1. In Phase 2, it's sensible that when you're talking about something technical like grid architecture, it may get a little lost in the translation. And so I wanted to ensure that when we started this 2-week phase that we did another reboot and talked about from 3 very different perspectives why we're doing this for the betterment of customers, the betterment of society, the betterment of the industry as a whole. We have 3 really amazing panelists. I have had the good fortune, as have many up here on the bench. We've had the good fortune of meeting, working, speaking with these 3 individuals. They were absolutely handpicked from the entire crop of grid modernization folks out there in the industries to come in and talk to us because from our perspective, their vision is that important, and we really wanted those perspectives. So we are very grateful to have David Owens, who's the now retired Executive Vice President, Business Operations Group and Regulatory Affairs from EEI. David is a household name in the electric industry, and so we are very, very fortunate to have David here with us. Rodger Smith, Senior Vice President and General Manager from Oracle Utilities, and Sayun Sukduang, President and Chief Executive Officer from ENGIE Resources. Gentlemen, we have had the opportunity to speak at the commission and then on various panels together, and we know that you are going to relay information that I think has not only been helpful to us up here, but will be helpful to the state of Ohio. So we're very grateful for your participation. We'll begin this morning with Mr. Owens. David.
Well, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to be before you today. Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, and the Commission staff. As you indicated, I'm David Owens, and I thought I retired in June of last year. But there's one word I need to learn how to put in my vocabulary, and that's called no. What I'd like to do is provide a context for grid modernization and then speed it up and talk in greater detail about some of the elements. I really reflect back to my career at EEI, and I would probably say the most telling period for me was during Superstorm Sandy, when I was asked to go over to FEMA for 2 weeks and to assist in the restoration efforts. You may recall that Superstorm Sandy was a storm that involved 26 different states. 70,000 workers were mobilized, and I got a real appreciation for the hard work of line workers. I also got a real appreciation of the need to make additional investments in our grid. So, for example, in some states in the Northeast, they didn't have smart meters. We didn't know what customers were out. And a lot of things came out of Superstorm Sandy, and I'll make some reference to that momentarily. The focus, in my view, has got to be about the customer. And I believe that a more dynamic and a more secure energy grid can be very beneficial to the customer. Not only are you able to integrate renewable technologies for cleaner energy, you're also giving the customer greater control over their energy use, their ability to manage their bills, and a broad array of new technologies. When I look at the private sector, just over the last 10 years, we'll spend close to $1 trillion in grid modernization, creating a much smarter and a cleaner energy infrastructure. The big debate today, we know that we're moving into a hybrid electric system where we have centralized generation and a broad array of distributed resources. And I know that this chart was probably relied on by other participants. But if you look very carefully at it, you'll see that there are generally 3 stages that we're going through. In some states, we're in stage 1, where we are modernizing the grid. In other states, we have a high array of distributed resources that we're dependent upon. I put Hawaii in that category. In those states where we have a high degree of distributed resources, we're seeking to create a market for those resources. We're seeking not only to create a market, but we're seeking to integrate those resources into the overall power planning process. And I think that's very, very significant because it creates a whole new set of challenges. Can you pass me my water, please? It creates a whole new set of challenges that we probably did not anticipate. See, this grid was not designed to deal with multi-directional flows. So it requires a whole new set of considerations. And I know when you had your prior sessions, you spoke about grid architect. I'll make some general reference to that as well. And so the concept that we're seeking to do is to really balance 3 objectives at the same time. We're trying to make sure that we provide customers the highest level of reliability. And under that, I also put the word resilience. When you have a disruption, you want to be able to bring the system back, provide electric service very quickly back to the customer. So we're trying to balance reliability, sustainability, and affordability. It's a very, very difficult challenge in light of all the technological changes and in light of how the grid will be used in the future. When I look at grid modernization, I look at it in a holistic way. I, for example, look at the whole notion of distributive energy resources that you're trying to integrate into the grid. I look at the notion of microgrids because the grid is really the platform for a broad array of newer technologies. And then on the far extreme, I look at the notion of data analytics and increased challenges with cybersecurity. So when you look at smarter energy infrastructure, you have to take a holistic look. You have to look at the interrelationship of all of these very significant factors. When I look at smarter energy infrastructure and the drivers of that, customers want change. Customers want a clean environment. Customers want flexibility. Customers want to be able to employ a broad array of newer technologies. They want enhanced reliability. They want greater resiliency. They want cleaner energy. They want to have the ability to make their own decisions about their energy use. That's what smarter energy infrastructure does. It gives customer a broad array of new benefits. We also know, too, that a whole new set of challenges are presented. We know that data analytics is very important, that you need to have enhanced visibility about the grid. What is occurring on that grid? We also know, too, that we need to make those investments to modernize that grid so it can accommodate a whole array of new technologies. We know as well that data analytics is very helpful in us understanding all the dynamics of the grid and how we can reduce outages and have better information about how those technologies can be beneficial to the grid. And we also know, too, that data analytics can be very helpful for behind-the-meter services to customers. It gives the customers a broad array of information about how they can better manage their energy use and their energy bills. See, I believe that we're on the cutting edge of a tremendous transformation through the grid. And I believe that that transformation is fairly significant because it's relying increasingly on artificial intelligence. It's relying increasingly on information about all aspects of the grid. I believe that this change that we're seeing is one that seeks to enhance customer services. This transformation that we're seeing is one that will evolve smart cities, something that's taken place here in Columbus, Ohio. There are a significant number of public policy questions that arise when we look at this grid, from planning issues, because the planning process has got to change. If we're looking at distributed resources and we're looking at the traditional way that we plan with centralized resources, you've got to now have a collaborative process where you bring and understand what those distributed resources is and you integrate them with the overall planning process. So how should the grid be constructed? All of these were questions that you dealt with in your prior sections. How do you price the grid? How do you determine rates? Whole array of new issues that we've got to deal with. See, when I look at the grid and I look at a smarter energy infrastructure, I don't only just look at superior customer solutions that are enabled by this grid or the enhancement of reliability and safety and resilience or the need for coordinated planning or the need for all of these new technologies to be able to talk to one another, to be able to operate in an integrated fashion. I don't also just look at the need for much more investment in that grid, but I look at the recognition that as we have a grid that relies increasingly on distributive technologies, that there's got to be increased visibility for those who operate the grid. There's got to be, I don't like to use the word control, but there's got to be increased coordination. Because if you have the responsibility of keeping the lights on, you need to know what all those technologies are that are on the grid. You need to be able to see them. You need to be able to interact with them. You need to be able to coordinate with them. You need to be able to have information about those resources. And certainly cybersecurity creates a huge set of issues. But you also need different pricing models. The traditional pricing models will not work. And we know that there'll be an array of services that have to be priced very, very differently. You have to pay for that infrastructure that you are evolving. And that requires a whole new way of pricing grid-related services. The customer is changing. See, it used to be you focused on sales to the customer. We used to believe that all customer classes were homogeneous, that the residential class, the commercial class were homogeneous classes. But they're not. They're heterogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. Because, for example, within the residential class, you have some customers that may have their own power supply source. Or let me say it differently. I'm a baby boomer. You have millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers. And we all have different tastes. And so increasingly, we've got to acknowledge that our customer classes are very, very different. It's no longer the focus on increased sales, it's a focus on increased services. It's no longer focus on growth and assets, it's a focus now, how do we make that grid much more responsible to changing customer needs? So when you look at pricing services from the grid, you have to acknowledge that the customer is very, very different today. Customer wants customized services, individualized services, as I was trying to stress earlier. Some customers want the opportunity to have electric vehicles. The industry, as an example, is transforming their fleet, $250 million in electric vehicles. Energy storage has another important role in the changing grid architecture. And we can try to define energy storage, but it's valuable on all aspects of the grid. It has tremendous versatility. And a fundamental question, particularly in states that have organized markets, what is the role of the utility? Can the utility provide behind-the-meter services? Can the utility be actively involved in storage? In fact, what is storage? It is a power supply source. Is it a source that is used at the distribution system to enhance ancillary services, voltage support, frequency control? What is storage? And that's a huge issue. And the relationship of that issue to the utility is very critical. Microgrids, evolving. Some customers want greater resiliency, so they're willing to make the additional investment in order to enhance their overall reliability. And microgrids are evolving very significantly. They are not cheap. Smart cities, all aspects of that. The integration of energy, transportation, and communication. All of these items that I'm mentioning are all a part of a smarter energy infrastructure. All a part of grid modernization. Smarter street lighting. Smarter buildings, where you can walk into a building and the lights and the temperature of those buildings are automatically controlled. An electric vehicle, and you have traffic lights that are controlled, and they communicate with an autonomous vehicle. Distributed energy resources, data analytics and intelligence services, all of those are elements of a smart community. So the issue is, and I left this slide here intentionally blank because I wanted you to use your imagination. Now let me see if I have my imagination and brought my answer to this slide. So we look at both sides of the slide. One part of the slide speaks to challenges. The other part of the slide speaks to the ways forward. So let's look at the challenges if we're looking at rate and regulatory reform. Well, let me see. Well, one challenge is technology is changing very quickly. Another challenge is customers have changing needs and expectations. Okay, that's true. Another challenge is one size doesn't fit all. Our rate-making policies, traditionally to some degree, have focused on a one-size-fits-all approach. Another challenge is that sometimes our regulatory processes are slow and inflexible. Well, what do we do about this? Well, I believe that we, in our regulatory processes, need to focus more on collaboration rather than confrontation. I believe that we need to move increasingly towards performance-based rate making. I believe because the customers are very different, that we need to focus on flexible rate structures. I believe if we're modernizing this grid, if we're making it much smarter, that we need transparent pricing for grid and energy services. Now, you may not agree with me, but that's why I left this slide blank, just to have you think about the challenges that we have as we seek to have our overall energy delivery system be much more complex. A lot of policy issues are presented, and I dealt with these significantly when I was at EEI. Can a utility own or provide services behind the meter? Can the utility be in the microgrids? Can the utility build electric charging stations? What are some of the issues? Good luck in your confirmation hearings. Are there additional challenges with respect to making investments and recovering the costs? And what's the business case for those investments that you're making? And utilities have to be prepared to explain that. It requires significant education, and I think that this forum is good for that, outreach, and collaboration. But a whole new set of challenges are being created as we look to a more digitized grid, a much smarter grid. And those are challenges with respect to cybersecurity. And we know these are huge issues. We know that securing and protecting the grid is a top priority for utilities. And we know that the utility industry, all sectors, are making significant investments in cybersecurity. We also know, too, at the federal level, we have a lot of rules that deal with cybersecurity. But we know individually the states have their respective responsibilities. Query: should there be rules that are uniform across all the states at the distribution level for cybersecurity? And as we move increasingly towards a much more smarter grid, where we're integrating wholesale and retail markets, how do we, or should we, seek to make cybersecurity rules more homogeneous? I don't know. But I do know that that's a significant challenge. And the industry has decided that cybersecurity is such a significant issue, much like we have in our mutual assistance program for storm response and recovery. We have a cyber mutual assistance team. And that team will, if there's a major disruption, they'll share information and they'll collectively work together to restore service, to troubleshoot, to find out where that cybersecurity issue is. Grid modernization is a significant issue, not only on the mainland, but in Puerto Rico. And so as part of my retirement, I decided that I needed to do something in Puerto Rico. So I was asked to help out in rebuilding the Puerto Rican electric system. You know, most of you know that in Puerto Rico, the generation is old. There's a substantial reliance on oil. That the principal generators are located in the south, and the demand is in the north, and it's linked through high voltage transmission that covers mountainous terrain. You all know, too, that there were significant outages that occurred in September from back-to-back hurricanes. The transmission system is very poorly designed and operated. The infrastructure has not been adequately maintained. There's very poor vegetation management. I've never seen such poor vegetation management. And there's no enforceability of that. And there's high vulnerability for tremendous outages because of the way that the system has been designed. There's poor customer service. There's a high level of losses, and there's energy theft. They're inconsistent and unreliable and outdated IT systems. and there are disorganized and ineffective customer service infrastructure. Now, why am I telling you this? This is the antithesis of a smarter energy infrastructure. And so all the things that we're speaking about are the challenges that I have, as well as a team of other folks, in trying to bring some logic to the Puerto Rican electric system. So I chair the Transformation Advisory Council. It's an independent group. My salary is $5 million a year times 0. And I believe that if we're trying to do that, that there are certain key elements that need to be focused on. Reliability and resiliency. You need to make that a top priority. The system that I'm going to recommend that they seek to build is a system that puts reliability and resiliency at the top of the list. The system that I'm seeking to have them build is a system that says the customer is central. The system that I'm seeking to have them build is a system that promotes financial viability, that has a regulatory structure, that encourages the investment in capital, the investment in infrastructure, and the return of that capital. The system that I'm seeking to have them build is a system that's a model for sustainability, that moves increasingly to clean energy, that in fact recognizes that you need to have the power supply source close to the load center. The system that I want to have constructed is one that recognizes that the grid is the economic engine. It's the element for growth. It's the element for sustainability. The grid that I'm having them focus on is one that acknowledges that microgrids may be helpful in certain areas and renewable technologies. But the main element is you need a backbone grid because you have to have that reliance. So you have to do something about that grid. You have to have a backbone grid. The grid that I'm seeking to have them build is one that uses advanced distribution management systems. It's a grid that recognizes that we need to have a distribution energy management system if we're going to have more distributed resources. The grid that I'm having them focus on is one that has effective management strategies. And that when you have an outage, you have spares that are well managed. And the grid that I'm having them deal with is one that has robust vegetation management and enforcement. All of these are attributes of the U.S. mainland grid. All of these are attributes that I spoke to earlier. We have the opportunity to build a world-class grid in Puerto Rico, and I think we can use some of the examples from the mainland U.S. Let me conclude. I strongly believe that the integrated energy grid is the backbone of our economy. I believe it's very, very important to make major investments in that grid. I believe that we are in a substantial period of transformation through the grid. I believe that customers have to be empowered, and the grid does that by providing for the integration of a broad array of technologies. I believe that regulation has to keep step with the challenges and the changes that are taking place with respect to the grid. And then finally, I believe that grid security is a top priority. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, David. Rodger?
Good morning, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. The chairman and I have been on several panels together and had some interesting conversations about this particular topic. My name is Rodger Smith. I do run the global utilities business at Oracle, but I've been in this business since 1980. That's a long time. I started my career, 16 years of it, at a larger utility in the southeastern U.S. where I did nuclear construction, the independent power business, the generation business. I moved from there into the consulting industry and was with one of the big six in the utility business still for about 7 years. Was the president of a construction engineering company for about 8.5 years, still in the energy business, and proud to say that I went to work for Oracle and started the global utilities business there about 7 years ago. And the reason I did that was really for the subject I'm about ready to go over today, which is the dynamic changes in this industry really driven by technology. I've seen a lot of changes since 1980 in this industry, a lot of changes. But I can tell you, I don't think that the last 40 or so years have anything on what we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. Change will be exponential, and the key to the success of this industry is going to be whether regulators and utilities can be on the same page with regard to the pace of that change. Let me give you one example. We're going to focus today on the customer side of the business. We in Oracle Utilities build software essentially to run every gamut of a utility. So whether it's the generation side of the business, transmission, distribution, customer. At the request of the chairman, I'll focus on the customer side of the business today. And talk a little bit about using technology innovation to enhance customer experiences. But let me tell you a little bit about that change I've seen since 1980. Not too many years after I started, as I watched other utilities around the country and battle in rate cases and commissions in those days, there was a lot of anxiety in those days about capital spend and other things. And I'll never forget a bumper sticker that I saw in this industry back about 1982. And when a utility didn't do very well at its rate case, the bumper sticker read, "Let them freeze in the dark." And that was referring to the customers. We've gone from that perspective back in the early 80s to today where customers are really leading the change in this industry. And so that alone indicates how much change we've seen since 1980. But again, the change we've seen since 1980 will pale in comparison to the changes that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. I apologize in advance. I'm going to read a lot of my remarks today because I've got 20 minutes. I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to have you drink out of a fire hose essentially for the next 20 minutes or so. So let's get started. The utility industry is facing an evolution in its relationship with its customers. What used to be purely transactional is turning into more of a partnership, a customer-centric approach to doing business. Typically, customer centricity means putting the customer at the center of the focus of your business with the understanding that creating meaningful customer value and really putting customers first is the best way to engender the most and the longest lasting business value. It's a concept that has long been associated with the retail and hospitality sectors and is gaining ground with the utility industry as utilities have begun to embrace the importance of CX, or customer experience. Technology innovation has spurred this evolution, enabling more choice, and customers now want their utility providers to provide the same instant access to their most up-to-date information on the platform of their choice that they receive from their other service providers. And I might say my comments today, this is some observations we're seeing globally today, and then I'll talk to you about some things we think will happen as well in the future. But clearly across the globe, we're seeing the customers playing more important roles. Technological innovation has spurred this evolution, enabling more choice, and customers now want their utility providers to provide the same instant access to the most up-to-date information on the platform of their choice that they receive from other service providers. Today's customers expect personalized, timely, actionable insights, seamless experiences across platforms, and ease of use. We need to start where the customers are. The customer is the catalyst for change, and technology is the future enabler. Active customer participation is putting the customer at the center of the utility equation like never before, and fundamentally different approach is needed to accommodate this change. This approach, I believe, has its foundation in digital transformation. In fact, customer experience is typically where utilities start to address the digitization of their enterprise by connecting to customers digitally and communicating across multiple channels to provide information to them more quickly and easily. And it's not just faster information, I might add. Today's customers want different information. Digital transformation is also making it possible for the utility to quickly pivot as customer expectations and communications tend to change, and allows for deeper level of customer engagement across all channels. And I keep saying across all channels. Customers want access to that information in many different ways, whether it's by home computer, whether it's on their mobile device, whether it's traditional access through mail or other channels. What does this look like? Well, in our case, utilities are increasingly asking us to help them provide new services and new experiences for the customers. These are not hypothetical services and experiences to be enabled by some future utility, but services we are already empowering today's utilities to provide. And I'd like to give you a couple examples. First, behavioral demand response and peak time rebates. Behavioral demand response uses behavioral prompts and personalized relevant advice to encourage customers to save energy, while peak time rebates use monetary incentives, a rebate that they can redeem on their next bill, to prompt customers to save. Home energy analysis is another area. Utilities are using our energy management web portal to help customers learn more about their energy usage and providing online home energy audit to engage customers and collect more information about them and their specific needs so that you can better target programs and products for that particular customer. Corporate procurement of renewables, something we're seeing globally. Leading companies are making commitments to power their operations with renewable energy, and many are turning to utilities to source renewable energy. Renewable energy tariffs are just one option, allowing C&I customers to tailor their own energy supply to achieve their corporate goals. In the future, customers will be able to individualize their energy service to meet goals for reliability, predictability, and risk tolerance. And finally, advanced distribution management systems, or as we all know, ADMS. ADMS can ingest data from distribution SCADA and GIS, as well as AMI, to provide visibility not only at the distribution circuits, but also at the customer premises and DERs at the grid edge. This enables more robust management of the distribution system, including predictive maintenance of grid assets, faster fault detection and service restoration, and accurate pricing signals that guide customer investment in DERs that will help them manage energy costs and at the same time provide beneficial grid services. I might add too, we're seeing this circular, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, the old linear idea of the utility model, where it goes from generation to the customer through transmission distribution, is no longer appropriate. That's now a virtuous circle almost, because customers are taking more advantage at the edge of the grid, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Customers are hungry for these new services, as studies such as the J.D. Power Residential Electric Utility Customer Satisfaction Study clearly show. In fact, that particular study has shown a 6-year upward trend in residential customer satisfaction scores, showing an increase in electric bill pay, paperless communications on the rise, website access is going mobile. 68% of customers in 2017 believe their utility is focused on improving the infrastructure to improve safety and reliability. And by the way, that's up 5% in just 1 year. Utility C&I customers are equally hungry for new services, and key energy efficiency and demand response programs have been shown to significantly increase these large customer satisfaction ratings. The opportunity of grid modernization is undergirded by the data flow from the AMI meters and software used to collect and process this data. But simply installing the AMI won't unlock customer benefits or enable the services promised by this technology. I'd like to share 2 examples of how Oracle partners with utilities to unlock the customer value of AMI and provide customers with the services and experiences they demand. Right here in Ohio, we worked with AEP of Ohio to develop a unique customer experience that will accompany AEP's territorial-wide AMI deployment. As a customer receives their new meter, they will begin to receive monthly reports containing personalized energy insights and relevant tips to manage consumption. If a consumer is using more energy than normal, they will receive a notice alerting them that they are tracked for a higher bill and recommending several actions to help them bring their bill back down. We believe that all customers are entitled to information from their meters in a way that is simple, insightful, and actionable. We partner with Baltimore Gas and Electric to implement the nation's largest peak time PTR program. The PTR program rewards customers with bill credits for reducing their consumption during peak events. Customers receive pre-event notifications alerting them of the opportunity to save, and timely post-event reports telling them how much they earned. Delivered on an opt-out basis, the PTR program reaches over 1 million residential customers, consistently delivers 13 to 17% demand reduction, and enjoys high level of customer satisfaction. You as regulators need to understand that these new, more robust customer experiences mean for regulation. I'd like to spend a little time describing some issues I think are critically important. The meter and the data it provides sits at the middle of the experience I've described. I think this means, frankly, two things. First, the straightforward conclusion is that you need AMI. Richer services require richer data. There is currently no better alternative to AMI to measure things like timing of energy consumption, peak usage, and power quality, although I think there will in the near future be some alternatives to AMI as well. Second, the meter itself is no longer a meaningful border or delineation line between the utility and the customer. This may be some of the biggest psychological advances we need to make in this industry is how we perceive the meter. When customers demand new services on both sides of the meter, sometimes at the same time, the meter becomes irrelevant as anything other than a measurement tool. We need to stop thinking about behind the meter and in front of the meter as meaningful concepts, and instead focus on the best way to provide a more holistic approach to providing an experience that delights customers in this industry. An equally important regulatory consideration is this: customers can no longer be considered as mere endpoints on the grid or load at the end of the wire. The old paradigm was a linear system that flowed from generation to transmission to distribution and ended with the customer. The old system will rapidly be replaced by a circular system where customers can react to changing system demands and provide valuable services back to the grid. Customers are active participants both in energy usage and increasingly their energy production as well. This is changing the way in which utilities need to operate. Utilities will need to account for customer behaviors and how they plan and operate the grid. Utilities will need to have better visibility at the edge of the grid to be able to manage the entire energy equation in a real-time manner. To do that, new generation grid tools need to account for every individual resource in the grid, not just the traditional feeders and circuits or even the traditional households or C&I customers. Again, this ties back to the need to eliminate the artificial barrier between the utility and the customer historically represented by the meter. It's standing in the way of good grid management. I'm not suggesting eliminating meters yet as a tool, but it's time to change what the meter physically represents. Data needs to be allowed to flow seamlessly in all directions. Utilities will need visibility and access to data from the edge of the grid. Customers will need access to their own data and the ability to share it with third parties if they choose to do so. Utilities also need to be able to share with third parties as necessary as they seek new solutions to grid challenges. Kilowatt hours may in fact be the least important element of data that needs to flow between utilities, customers, and third parties in the future. Other critically important information includes data on time and location-based value of DER, the expected restoration time of an outage, the maintenance status of assets at the distribution system, sensor data, grid edge technology, and the list goes on. The kilowatt hour which drives revenue today may become the least valuable commodity purchased by a consumer in the future. The other value-added products and solutions related to grid access and grid value may be what customers are buying, and this will be determined and priced by a variety of data sources. Regulators have a lot of work to do to figure out who owns the data and how to allow it to flow to other parties. That's a complicated discussion for another time. Right now I want to stress to you that what utilities invest in systems, or what kind of systems they invest in today, need to be focused around securing, storing, and transmitting critical data so that your future regulatory decisions aren't constrained by today's technology investments. The role of the utility, the service provider, and the customer will necessarily evolve over time. Globally, customers don't want to deal with multiple changing service providers. And by the way, that is a global phenomenon. What we've seen around the globe in study after study after study is that most of you customers are actually happy with their current provider. They just want more options. Some of those options will be provided by their existing utility and perhaps some by third parties. But utilities actually have some of the highest customer satisfaction ratings of any other industry based on customer satisfaction polls. Ohio is committed to competition, so customers will always have the ability to choose. For customers to enjoy the most meaningful choices in a robust competitive market, utilities need to be able to offer their customers new value-added experiences. Utilities also should also ensure that those customers that lack means of motivation to adopt DERs are not left behind or burdened with unreasonable costs. That's an issue we see globally. People get excited about the new world, but there's a whole class of customers out there that may not be able to take advantage of that world, and we should not disadvantage them based on future policies for those who can take advantage of DER and other opportunities. I know that's a lot to digest, so I'd like to tie it up by describing a path you might take to enable customer-friendly future. First, as I just described, AMI is vital. This is the key to giving customers the information they need to get fully engaged. Second, once a customer has a smart meter, it doesn't make sense to have them on a dumb rate. You need to find ways to get more customers onto rates that both allocate costs equitably, send the appropriate signals to customers so they can act in ways that benefit both themselves and the grid. Third, new rates need to be accomplished by significant customer engagement. Please ensure that customers have the information they need to both get on advanced rate plans and respond to the new rate. This is especially true for price-sensitive and hard-to-reach customers. Vulnerable customers can benefit from new rates, but it's important that we all do everything we can to make sure that they see the benefits as well. Fourth, AMI, new rates, and engaged customers will combine to create new data to be managed. I don't presume to know exactly how all this should happen, but I do know that you want to get in front of the issue. I encourage you to take steps to ensure that data is stored securely and transferred appropriately to the people who need it. Fifth and finally, all these new systems will be powered by software and information technology. Utilities are following other industries in adopting cloud-based computing, which can help business optimize IT spend and improve their operations by allowing them to focus more on innovation and less on routine maintenance. You have a role to play in making the move to the cloud happen faster. Today, utilities earn a rate of return on traditional on-premise systems where software is stored on servers that the utility owns. You should level the playing field by also allowing utilities to put cloud-based software in the rate base. The amount of technologies can be required in the future, the amount of changes that technology will require, I believe will become overwhelming to most utility IT organizations. I'd encourage you to follow the recommendation of 2016 NARUC resolution on this issue and consider ways to make utilities whole as they adopt modern technology solutions and focus organizations more on innovation. In conclusion, I've talked at length this morning about the needs and demands of the active, more participatory utility customer, the needs of the utility in this new and quickly changing environment, and the regulatory changes that public utility commissioners across the country and frankly around the globe need to examine to help utilities provide new, more meaningful customer experiences. For utilities and their regulators to keep up with their customers, we need to change the way we think about the grid. The historic one-way power flow is becoming a thing of the past, a dinosaur in the world of modern man. The grid is becoming a vibrant ecosystem of services that need to flow seamlessly and multi-directionally from one edge of the grid to the other. As we continue to discuss considerations for new rate making and regulatory policy over the next 3 days, I'd like you to keep that vision in mind if you would. Let me leave you with an example courtesy of Henry Ford. Ford's invention of the assembly line made his Model T widely available and inexpensive enough for almost everyone to afford an automobile. But it came in one color, black, and it came with one set of options, and everyone got the same options. Then customers demanded change. They wanted to be able to customize their automobiles. By using the assembly line as the backbone for the industry, Ford met those changing customer demands, and today you can have an automobile in almost any configuration you would like. If you look at the electric utility industry today, the assembly line, the grid is in place. As they did with the automobile, customers are now demanding that electricity and associated services be delivered in innovative ways by using the grid, which is transforming to meet customers' evolving and customized needs. We need to ensure that policies are in place to keep up with those needs. I thank you for your time today. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodger. Sayun?
All I can say is, wow. That's pretty impressive. And when I think about that, you have 72 more to go after me. Thank you for having me. I appreciate everybody's time. I want to step back because I have nowhere near the experience of David and Rodger. But the angle that I can provide is actually an angle you asked us to address. The vision for the customer. And we talked a lot this morning already about things I would actually say the customer doesn't want. They don't want behavioral demand response. They don't know what DER is. Very few people in this room woke up this morning and said, I would like some kilowatt hours. What do customers really want? And is it evolving? My answer, it's easy and it's not evolving. They want three things when it comes to our industry. They want light, climate control, and device functionality. Those are the three things they want. And I think that we as an industry have to realize that we are pushing upon them our techno speak instead of taking at the center what they truly desire. And if we step back and analyze that customer vision from those three simple things, I think we could end up with a very different solution when it comes to what we discuss around grid modernization, independent power producers, where the line of utility starts and ends, what competitive means, and even choice. I'll take choice first. Customers don't necessarily want choice. What they want is sovereignty from people like us. And that sovereignty may come in the form of choice, or it may come in the form of you do what I need you to do as an industry. Again, provide me that light, that climate control, and my devices to function. So I'd like to provide a narrative from a customer perspective about us in this room. And the narrative I'd like to provide is something that I think every customer can relate to. And I'll go to my current hometown, Houston, Texas. Some people would dispute it's the energy capital of the world. Also, probably a disputable fact is it has the largest highway in the world that goes through the center of it. It's called I-10, the Katy Freeway. It's 26 lanes wide at its widest point. Inevitably, 2 to 4 times a day, that highway, instead of being able to go the posted speed of 60 miles per hour, you will travel 30 miles per hour, 20 miles per hour. And we as society look at that and say, we'll live with that, but we have a way to solve it. The way to solve it is quite simple. We don't lack any of the technology, just like we don't lack any of the technology when I get to that point in our energy industry. We don't lack the technology to improve it, so we go 60 miles per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's called concrete. It's called rebar. It's called a bulldozer. Why don't we fix that? We don't fix that because we as society, as a customer, can see that that's not the right thing to do. You would look at that 100-lane highway, if we so choose to fix it, and say, what did we do? At 2 in the afternoon, 100 lanes, mostly unused, the cost, the environmental impact, we can see, everybody can see, it was the wrong thing to do. Why do I give you that analogy? Look on every single wall, look on the ceiling, look on the floor. What's happening right now? You are getting 60 hertz, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If it drops to 59.9, what are we going to do? We're going to build another lane on the highway. It's in the form of a power plant, a transmission line, a pipeline. Why do we do that with the electric grid and not the highway? There's many reasons, but one simple reason is we don't see it. Wall outlet right there, we don't see that transmission line. the distribution line, the pipeline, the power plant. We're very good as an industry at putting them in places where it's not observed. But from a customer perspective, what we are really doing in this room is promoting the build-out of 100-lane highways. And my view is that's not the right thing to do, because we have a way to solve that. And I'll give the 1.0 way, but we really need to set that forward customer vision. But the 1.0 way, some in this room will say this is semantics. But let's look at the grid. We all know that we have peak demand. And I'll go back to the state of Texas, again, my home state. 2, maybe 3 times a year, maybe 2, 3 times a year every 5 years, that 60 hertz dips a little. And it dips a little when supply and demand get tight. And a big part of our industry looks at that and says, guess what? We are necessary. Society needs us. We're going to go build something. In fact, that's the world I used to live in. I used to site and build power plants, and I would love it when I see price volatility. And when we see that, what goes through an infrastructure mindset is that a power plant's necessary, a pipeline, transmission line. And what's a power plant cost? Let's use a standard unit size of a combined cycle. 2 on 1 gas turbine, 1 steam turbine, 1,000 megawatts, about $1 billion. So here, 2 to 3 times a year, every 5 years, society needs me, I'll go spend $1 billion to fix it, help society. What could we do? That 1,000 megawatt plant feeds about the peak capacity of 600,000 houses. Everybody in this room knows what a smart thermostat is. You can walk into any big box retailer and buy one for $200. 600,000 homes times $200 is $120 million. Do we, as customers that want light, climate control, and device functionality, do we have the flexibility to live with 2 degrees warmer temperature for that 1 hour or that 15 minutes? I'd say yes, and we can solve that problem of 60 hertz, instead of deploying $1 billion in what most of this room would say we can do for society. We can deploy it with a $120 million, 200 times 600,000. And we have to start thinking in those terms. But that's a 1.0. That's demand response for the cynics in the room. Let's fast forward. Let's think more customer-centric. But let's get outside of our industry. Everybody's familiar with Uber. If I ask most people, what is Uber? They'd say it's a new form of taxi cab companies. I'd say that's not how I see Uber, and probably not how we should see Uber. Uber, to me, is an infrastructure optimization company. What has it done? It has taken stranded vehicle capacity, excess labor, workforce, and the need for transportation, and what it has done, without infrastructure investment, it has connected those 3 things and optimized society. No need to build a new taxi cab. No need to create union halls or employment centers. It debottlenecked infrastructure that already existed in society. Why do I give you that example of Uber? We have to look at how do we empower customers around those 3 things I mentioned: light, climate control, device functionality, and unlock the need to always solve it with infrastructure. Let's connect the two and then go back to the energy industry. The two, I mean, Uber and the highway. I used to tell my children, when I tried to explain what computers do, that they do very structured tasks, but they can't do things such as drive a car. I was wrong. We all in this room can envision a future where that car can drive itself. And if you think about Interstate 10, that 26-lane highway, and how we live with going less than 60 miles per hour, what happens when cars start to get smarter? When they don't need lanes, when they don't need prescribed direction of travel, where they don't need stoplights. Do we envision a day where cars can move like fish can swim? It might be possible. The infrastructure that exists through the heart of Houston at 26 lanes might be enough infrastructure capacity to last us the next century if we apply what is happening outside of that road construction industry to that business problem. We can get 60 mile per hour forward motion 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without deploying what we traditionally do. Guess what? Electrons can already move like fish can swim. Why hasn't our industry adapted? It's because we lack what true customer centricity is. So let's take a 2.0 model. Back to our industry. I'm not going to ask because somebody will always challenge me on this. But who knows what temperature the freezer is right now? Probably nobody. They just know it's frozen. And they know that's below, hopefully, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Why do I give you that analogy, that statement? Because we have an opportunity. Nothing prevents us from doing this. But we have an opportunity to engage with customers around, again, what they want. And what they want is climate control to preserve food. And do you think a customer really cares if that freezer is 24 degrees Fahrenheit versus 28 degrees Fahrenheit? The only repercussion I thought of is if at 2 in the morning, which Chairman Haque, you may be getting up with that child you have at 2 in the morning, the repercussion is your ice cream may be very difficult to scoop if I make your freezer too cold. That's the only repercussion. So why can't we, as an industry, engage a customer around that outcome? Provide them that temperature, but at 2 in the morning, use that freezer to get down to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. And at 7 in the morning, allow that compressor to shut off and warm back up to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. And ultimately, sell to customers the experience that they truly want, relying on us as an industry to do what our job is. And what our job is very different than what customers want. What our job is exactly what David and Rodger said. Our job is to make sure it's low cost, reliable, and environmentally sustainable. That's our job. That is not to be confused with what a customer wants. We need to do our job and deliver 3 simple things. Let's go to a 3.0 version. The 3.0 version, you have in the coming days electric cars. Do people really want to buy energy storage in a vehicle? What they really want is transportation. And by transportation, if they walk into that electric car dealership today, it's a very difficult process to think through. Do I want a Tesla P80, P90, P100 Ludicrous? Which one do I want? And the thing that goes through their mind is performance, but more importantly, distance. Will I need to go 360 miles per hour, 360 miles someday, even though I only go 20 miles to work each day? Our industry, how should we look at the electric car? Why can't we, just like light, climate control, and device functionality, also migrate to optimize existing infrastructure and provide transportation, distance, and engage with that customer and say, if you buy the P80, and based on what you need, which is transportation to and from work Monday through Friday, which is 40 miles, and on the weekend, you want to go to the kids' sporting events, which are in the next city, and you need 200 miles, well, that will be $100 a month. But if you buy the P90, slightly bigger, more transportation capacity, and you have that same behavior, guess what? It's going to be $50 a month. Why? Because there's excess infrastructure capacity in that vehicle. That vehicle can store off-peak energy. That vehicle can drive that energy to the load center, offsetting the need for transmission and distribution. And when a customer engages around a transportation choice, that excess infrastructure, just like that infrastructure in your freezer, just like version 1.0, demand response with a thermostat, has more value to society than just getting from point A to point B. And we have to start thinking about our job is an infrastructure optimization job, delivering to a customer the final outcomes they want, not a kilowatt hour, not demand response. So I'd like to conclude on a point that we as an industry have to stop talking about ourselves and our economic model. We have to really step back and think about true customer centricity. And one very easy thing to highlight to show where we've come from where we started is back to Edison. Edison never sold a kilowatt hour. How did the grid start? He sold light bulbs. And when your light bulb burned out, you went to him and bought another light bulb. The repercussion was he had to put this electric line into your house, but he sold light. And if we go back to that framework and think from that point forward, what type of design would our industry take? Thank you for your time. More than glad to answer questions about that.
Sayun, thank you very much. Let me just begin with, first of all, wonderful presentations. Thank you very much to the three panelists. Sayun, let me begin with a few questions for you. When I talk about grid modernization and when I talk about Power Forward, one thing I struggle with is the concept of build the grid out and the regulatory climate to get to the light bulb, or what is it that customers really want, what's the application, what's the light bulb, and sort of work backwards from there. And so it sounds like to me that your company have identified sort of these three customer-centric necessities or desires for customers, the climate control, light, devices to function. So let's now let's now possibly work backwards from there and even get to the sort of heart of what potentially have to be important, without having to do a deep dive into Ohio's, statutory regime or rate-making regime. But from where you sit, if we agree with you and we want for those customers to be able to have those three things, from a regulatory body like ours, what are some important considerations or possible pivot points if we adopt your thinking? Because I do agree with you. I mean, I've been doing a lot of speaking and discussion about grid mod, and it's hard when you say you want to enhance the customer electricity experience, and then you're talking about OT, IT convergence, CapEx versus OpEx. I mean, these are all things that really don't resonate. So, can you talk to us a little bit about that piece? What are, from a regulatory perspective, what should we, if we want to get to that outcome, what do we need to do?
So I admit that the way I frame it is very simplistic, and where we sit today is very complex. But actually, I think there are a couple key things that aren't really that difficult that will allow that, as I mentioned, sovereignty to occur. I'll give an example. You as a customer probably would love if I came to you and said to you, what temperature would you like in your home? You tell me 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Say, okay, well, when you're not home, can you live with 4 or 5 degrees difference in that? And when you are home, can you live with 1 degree of difference? And you say, yes, probably. Say, okay, that's $100 a month. But then I tell you, well, if you can live with 2 degrees while you're home and 8 degrees when you're not, well, your bill will go down by 30%. You can start to make decisions around what you want, that outcome. How can we get from where we are today to that point? Well, I'll tell you what's missing. Yes, smart meter deployment is necessary. Do we have a positive result?
We do.
Okay, great. Congratulations.
Sorry, everyone. The wait is over.
So if we talk about that, yes, we need smart meter deployment. But beyond smart meter deployment, there are a couple simple things. Let's talk about billing. That's an example of where there's good intention, but an incomplete story. How could a company today, I'm not going to say a prescribed company, a utility, an IPP, a competitor supplier, a solar company, a battery installer, how could they actually deliver that vision, that temperature outcome, when we have rate-ready and bill-ready markets, where companies have to work through the technical constructs of yet another company, in this case a utility, to conform to their bill standards? That's the end state, the billing, the beginning state, the actual deployment of the meter. But when we think about this middle, also needs to be thought about. When you deploy smart meters, another good example of good intentions but an incomplete story. We deployed smart meters from a infrastructure perspective. What I mean by infrastructure perspective, how do I know where the grid is down? How do I know where to roll a truck? I can avoid labor from actually going and reading meters. That's the perspective we deploy smart meters. We didn't deploy it from the 2.0 and 3.0 versions of what could happen. And one important thing when we deploy smart meters is liquidity in the information that smart meter provides. And as an example, what good is getting customer smart meter data only after they become your customer? How can you find customers that you can benefit without being availed to their digital electrical personality? which is in the form of smart meter data. So from the beginning, smart meter deployment, all of you aware we need to do that. Second, not every territory is aware of this, but liquidity in that data, certainly under the umbrella of security. And then thirdly, the ability to innovate around these outcomes. I'm not going to say products, I'm not going to say choice, outcomes to deliver to customers what they really want. Those three things.
Okay, very good. Question for the entire group. You represent purposefully represent, I think, three different pockets of the industry that we have been very interested in hearing from. David from the utility perspective, Sayun from, we'll call it competitive retail perspective, although ENGIE is doing more and interesting stuff, especially on OSU's campus, and what we'll call, Rodger, from our perspective, the third-party technology lens. And so, based upon those perspectives, what are areas do you think that the regulatory body, as they advance their grid modernization, what are areas where you think there will be disagreement between the three of you? I'm not trying to spice up the panel here. That's not my intent. But you represent important perspectives, and as we advance towards with a desire to push out a policy piece that takes into account some of the pivotal questions, I'd really like to know what you believe to be some questions that we're going to have to answer that you might sort of differ in perspective from.
Well, maybe I'll start. And let me just say I appreciated my other two colleagues' presentations. I thought they were very thoughtful. If we're focusing on the customer and the relationship that the utility has with the customer, the Commission has got to look at a different role for the utility. Traditionally, we've looked at the role of the utility, and Sayun, forgive me for saying in front of and behind the meter. We looked at the role of the utility substantially in front of the meter, providing reliable service, affordable service, and obviously clean energy. But increasingly now, if we're looking at the customer experience, we're looking at a broad array of involvement of the customer and the utility behind the meter. So the question becomes, should the utility be an active participant in areas that they traditionally may not have been? Let me say it more simplistically. Should the utility be a trusted energy advisor? Should they be able to provide a broad array of energy services? I commented that I didn't think the focus is on sales. The focus is on really the relation with the customer. Should the utility, as an example, be able to build charging stations? Should the utility be able to, partner with Oracle and others and not only put in smart meters, but also all the things that kind of tie into that smart meter, where you can control temperature, where you can control comfort? Should the utility be able to have the opportunity to be in those kinds of businesses? Should the utility be able to be very active in the customer's use of energy storage if they have rooftop solar? So to me, the question is, can the utility be very active in behind-the-meter services? And if you let them be active in behind-the-meter services, what is the regulatory structure for that utility to be involved in those services? Are they able to be in those services and provide those services to their own retail customers? Or do they have to create a separate entity that can't serve their retail customers but has the opportunity to serve other jurisdictions? I think that's a very vital question. I think there's a second set of questions. What's the pricing regime for that? And how do you ensure that you have a pricing regime that still permits the utility to take on the responsibility of building out the grid? Because, I've been in a lot of state proceedings, a lot of regulatory proceedings, and one of the biggest headaches are, How do you build the infrastructure, make sure that those who do not have the option to have rooftop solar and so forth, and those that do, they pay for the grid? How do you make sure that they pay for that? So pricing flexibility, doing it in a way where you're not shifting costs from one group of customers to another group of customers, but at the same time that you're able to put in the best technologies and enhance that grid. I think those are two very significant issues that have to be addressed.
Very good. And so, right now, utilities within our retail space, through an affiliate, an unregulated affiliate can participate in behind the meter activity. Does EEI have a position on that? Whether for grid whatever is dubbed a grid modernization opportunity, the utility should be able to rate base opportunities behind the meter, or continue to operate through an unregulated affiliate.
There are a broad array of approaches, and so EI doesn't say that one approach is better than the other approach. We accept all the approaches. The fundamental thing is give us the opportunity to be one of the providers for the customer. Doing it either through an affiliate or doing it directly as a utility. There are code of conduct standards where you can, in fact, monitor behavior and address any alleged concerns about affiliate abuse. And I think that those are tools that could be used. But I don't think there's a single approach. I think the fundamental issue is let them have the opportunity to also be a provider of services to the customer.
Very good. Rodger?
Yeah, from my perspective, and this, I'm not sure that the three of us would ever be in that much conflict. I can't afford to be in conflict with anybody because I keep selling stuff. So. But I do think there's going to be some areas of tension in the industry. I mentioned a couple, and then one that maybe we didn't really talk about. But I think the question of data, as the speakers have pointed out, there's going to be a lot more information regarding customers beyond the meter, and who has access to that information, who is the custodian of the information, how easily is that information guarded and secured. I think there's going to be some tension in the industry around that particular issue, because to the extent that the utilities control that information, I think that puts them in a position of being in absolute control of beyond the meter. I'm not sure in every jurisdiction across the globe that would be a bad thing, by the way. But on the other hand, I could see a lot of third parties wanting to have access to that information. I think there's a lot of things that have to be decided, because I do think meters are an unnecessary restrictor plate in some cases, and when you have all the sensor technology that was mentioned in the last presentation and all the sources of data that you might have that's being aggregated, how that data is aggregated, held, who holds it, who owns it, who's responsible for it, that's going to be a huge issue to resolve some of the things that we all talked about. So I think that's a point of contention. The second one is technology for the first time in this industry is way outpacing the industry's ability to absorb it. Utilities sometimes look at their commissions and put the blame there. Sometimes others put it on the utility. Sometimes they put it on third parties like me for not getting there quick enough. But I think the acceptance of technology and the pace of technology change is going to drive us to a lot of the future of this industry. And if we don't get a handle on how we're going to adopt new technologies and move more quickly than we have in the past, that's going to be a point of contention. The other thing, though, is and this is something I actually struggle with in our own business, but the thing we forget sometimes about this industry, it is a strategic industry. It is not like retail or other industries in some cases. It is extremely strategic to the economic development of the region it serves, and that's a global statement. I know of no economy globally that thrives with poor utilities, whether that be electric, water, natural gas, or whatever. You have to have a robust set of utilities, reasonably priced, in order to have economic development in your region. And to the extent you manipulate that model or try to get away from that to some extent, it has a huge impact. I would argue the UK model is not very productive and has forced them into a service economy. I have a lot of customers there who struggle with that regulatory compact all the time. We've seen issues in Germany and Japan. But clearly, this is a very strategic industry. And so in the back of my mind, I always have that playing, and that maybe we can't treat this industry like retail or like banking or like hospitality or other industries because it is so strategic to economic development. I think we'll see some stress around that general discussion, is where do I draw the line between taking all the gloves off in terms of how this industry responds to the technology changes that would allow it to a lot of different things, and still maintain that connection to economic development, make sure my region is as competitive as other regions in the world, so I continue to attract business from around the globe, et cetera. So, and Ohio's done a great job of that, I think, overall, over the last few years, given the benefit that we've seen in the economy. But I think that'll be a point of contention in a lot of regions that still needs to be considered. It's not like every other industry in that, one, we have an obligation to serve customers who are all economic different levels, but the other one is we are the linchpin to economic growth in the regions that we serve, and I think that'll be a continuing stress point for the industry as it tries to figure out how it adopts future technology and how it addresses data issues and how third parties are allowed to play.
Sai?
I'd like to give maybe first a strategic maybe disconnect between the different parties, and then maybe a more tactical disconnect. Neither one I think is a huge point of contention. But I didn't tell a bit about our company, but one thing to mention is we've made a very cognizant decision as a company to get fully into the customer side of the energy business and fully away from the centralized rent-seeking business models. And in doing so, the more strategic difference is we feel very firmly that the way to innovate is not to work under a dual bureaucratic rent-seeking business environment. Dual bureaucratic being utility, hopefully no offense taken, Public Utility Commission, and a rent-seeking model. That stifles innovation. So strategically, and we can say we went to independent power producers, we were an independent power producer, I would say that's only a couple degrees different from that dual bureaucratic rent-seeking business model, because what are IPPs doing now? Asking for nuke subsidies, asking for my coal pile to get some value associated with it, reliability must run contracts. It's not so different than the rent-seeking business model. So one strategic difference is we need to really aspire to true liberalization. What's the more tactical thing, something you can hold on to walking out of this room? It's as Rodger and David mentioned. I think data is going to be that critical frontier. And I'll give an example. It's unfortunately a bad example given recent events with Equifax, but let's talk about credit data. None of us in this room, just like we don't know what a kilowatt hour is, we couldn't interpret our credit data to determine how we should shop for home insurance. Should we be able to buy that big screen TV at the big box store? What our car insurance should cost? Your credit data is used for all sources of outcomes. And when you walk to that counter in that big box store, what you want is to bring that big screen TV home for the game. You don't want to have to go to some website, go through your credit data, figure out, are you the right customer for this big box retailer, and can you afford that TV? You want somebody to figure out with that data, is it the right thing for you? Data, in all the markets my company participates globally, is an area that has not been unlocked efficiently. I would say one of the best markets globally for data is Texas. It's still far behind. One key thing there is the data is not availed to service providers, no matter their value proposition, good or bad, and we have to make sure we keep bad actors out, but good or bad, that data is not availed so that we can deliver to customers outcomes that we have solved for them. And I think one of the more tactical things that will be a point of contention with, call it independent power producers or retailers or utilities, is how is that data curated and transferred? Because until that's unlocked, and then we already talked about the ability to bill, you will not be able to bring innovative things forward.
Very good. Commissioners, who's ready to ask questions? Larry?
I'll try to ask a question. You guys provided some really thought-provoking information. Thank you all for that. So far, I just said thank you for those in the back of the room that couldn't hear. So I really found intriguing your comments where you, at least in my perspective, if I understood your presentation in part anyway, to focus on asset optimization and device functionality. I think that's interesting because I want to tie that back to a comment that David made about the heterogeneous nature of the consumer population. And I guess, as Rodger indicated, data flow, data warehousing, access to data, ownership of data are key for the brave new world. I'm intrigued by the possibility there are going to be information systems and operating systems that are necessary to support the data so as to deliver to these heterogeneous subpopulations the device functionality that you had alluded to. In your minds, is it possible that these support systems be co-owned so we don't, through the rent-seeking paradigm, incur redundant costs for the consumer population?
So co-owned by
Well, fill in the
utility and
blank.
third parties.
Fill in the blank. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from a technology perspective, there's nothing that would prevent that. I think that's purely a governance discussion, in terms of who owns the data. Technology would allow, joint ownership without any question, and easy access to the data, assuming it's in a central location and is eagerly segregated to provide the information necessary for whoever are the co-owners. So there's no technology limitations associated with that. I think it's purely a policy issue in terms of ultimately how the data is collected and who owns it. And I do think that's critical, is who owns the data. And it gets more complex as you go beyond the meter in the new sense. And again, I think the meter is an artificial line, but as you talk about all the sensor technologies that have been mentioned here, and I do think most customers want that to be invisible, by the way. I don't think they want to be, definitely, some do, a lot of the millennials do, but a lot of customers don't want deep engagement. But that, you're going to be collecting data from well, just look at a meter. When I started, a meter had 12 reads a year.
Right.
That same meter today can have over 320,000 reads off a single meter in a year. So the data volumes are huge. So there's some cost associated with how much data will be out there. And now multiply that by all the sensor technologies and all the appliances that we're talking about. That data will be aggregated. So for every single consumer, you're talking about huge amounts of data by individual household, by C&I customers, et cetera. All that could be aggregated in a data center, no question about it. The technology is there to do it. As long as you set up how you want the data to be sliced and diced, it can all be done. I think the question then becomes who regulates the ownership of that information. But there's no technology limitations for sure.
I would agree with Rodger that there are no technology limitations. If I might just probe his answer just a little. To me, the concept is let's have a uniform platform. And does shared ownership give you a uniform platform? There are a lot of different platforms out there today. And really what you want to do is have a uniform platform. He mentioned monitors and sensors. That's really what's taking place. That's the artificial intelligence I made reference to. You're collecting huge amounts of data. You need to be able to structure that data so it's useful. So it means that you need a common platform that everybody can have access to. Now, it gets tricky when you say, what do you mean by access? Because as a baby boomer, I don't know whether I want everybody to know all the details of my private life, but a millennial may not care. And so that's where the differentiation takes place, in my view. But the goal should be a common uniform platform that can structure that information so it's useful for decision making, not only by the customer, but also by the participant who is serving the customer. Okay, I think that's very, very critical. Today we don't have that. And all the grid modernization proceedings that are taking place, they're all talking about different platforms. They're not talking about integrating those platforms. You have to integrate these platforms. You know, it's one thing with the grid, but you got to integrate the communication, all that. It's got to be integratable, in my view.
Yeah, I would agree.
I don't have anything to add to that, only something to amplify, and it's the comment that David mentions about the participant. I think that's the key question for all of you. How do we define and ensure that, one, you can be a participant, and two, that you're an upstanding participant? And once we figure that out and get that right, my view is if the participant bandwidth is wide for upstanding companies, and then there's things beyond that. The ability, when we say participation, it can't be availed to data just after they're your customer. You have to be availed to data before they're your customer. You have to be availed to data while, not 1 month after, during that customer engagement. How you are a participant is important. And then once you are a participant, what you're able to do with that customer, not having to go through an intermediary. And I keep harping on billing. That sounds very simple thing. But you can imagine the difficulties of any one of these, let's call them DER companies, suppliers, if they can't even bill their customer. It's a fundamental of engagement.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Commissioner Johnson.
Want to thank you for a great presentation, and but just wanted to go back to, and I guess before that, I want to say something very positive about Power Forward. It's given us a great opportunity to hear different views from all over the country, and also to give different groups that we regulate directly or indirectly an opportunity to talk to us and have communication back and forth. And we know that the system that we have, and virtually every other state has something very similar to the PUCO, where we have really we're pretty good with our staff and everybody of particularly utilities and others coming forward with a plan, and we go through it and we come up with some sort of it's a quasi-judicial process. It's not like you sit down around the table and discuss it, although there is that aspect, but it's much less formal. And I know one of the things that when I first took this job, people would say, if you ever have any questions, just give me a call. Well, when I have the questions, it's in the middle of a rate case, and I can't call them. And so I've had to work around that. So, but anyway, I just wanted to kind of follow up on the chairman's question about where the regulatory where this regulatory group and others like it, how we fit into, say, the next 10 years. And I can take anything you tell me as far as an answer to that. But I mean, this working together with the utilities and the regulatory, you know, is that enough for the way things are? And I'd add in the providers too, but I mean, is that enough in this time of great change?
So let me, if I might, I don't know, I always speak first, get you in trouble. But let me, if I might, probe your question. So we look at the prior system, which was one that I perceive to be one that is pretty litigious. Company puts together a rate proceeding, It goes to the commission, puts together their IRP and their challenges with respect to that. When the customer is building their own power supply, combined heat and power, some other forms of power supply because they have concerns about power quality, they're building their own microgrid, they're an integral part of that utility system. So it requires a dialogue to take place between that customer and that utility, an eyes-open dialogue, because the utility's plan needs to understand what its customer is doing. So that says more outreach and more collaboration. And if there's that level of outreach and collaboration, utility needs to know what that customer is doing, because they need visibility and they need some level of coordination, and some people call that control, because they have the ultimate responsibility to maintain reliability, protect resiliency, and so forth. So your overall planning process is one that's got to acknowledge that the customer now has options to provide their own energy. So you need it to be more collaborative. The regulatory climate, the commission has got to encourage a more collaborative process, a more eyes-open process, a process where the stakeholders come together and they understand what they're all seeking to try to achieve. I think all of them would want greater reliability, they would want affordability, and they would want cleaner energy. So if you start with those three elements and you focus on a way to move the ball forward by having greater stakeholder involvement, I think a lot could be accomplished. Most commissions don't do that. But I think it's a step. That's the change dynamics that I see. If we're looking at a more modernized grid, we're looking at greater data analytics, we're looking at smarter technologies that have monitors and sensors. It's going to, and we're looking at more partnerships too. That would be my other point, and that's what Rodger said. Because you're going to see instances evolve where the customer and utility are going to see eye to eye and say, we can do this together. You want that microgrid, but you want other things associated with that microgrid. You want your backup power supply. So my rate design may be different. Let's sit down and let's talk about what you desire and how I can be helpful in that. So I think greater collaboration is going to be very, very important.
Yeah, I would agree. And let me start off by saying that you've got some pretty well-run organizations here in Ohio and the utilities that serve you. And I think that this model, Power Forward, has gotten a lot of attention from around the country. So don't beat yourself up too badly. I mean, things are running pretty well in this state, I think. But you do bring up an interesting issue. And I think David's right. The old world of it being more litigious and other things, we got to set that aside, because it's going to take more cooperation than ever before between third parties, utilities, and commissions in order to work out some of these complex issues, and whether it's data or the impact that third parties have in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what I worry about, and this is what I see around the globe, is that the one constant, frankly, in the whole equation, frankly, in a lot of cases, it is the utility. It's been there for years and years and years. Commission staffs turn over. Third parties sometimes come in and out of business. Legislation changes cause different bends in the industry, but the constant is the utility. And I think somehow we need to figure out how to build those relationships where they last more than just a term of a commissioner or the length of a piece of legislation, whatever it might be. There needs to be, because these changes are going to last, I think, for a long time. The amount of speed it's going to take to address the changing technologies, and for the length of time, I don't see this ever going backward. We're not going to get to a time where technology changes slow down. I think, that's akin to believing in the 1880s we had invented everything, we could shut the patent office down. We're not going back there again. And so the old way of regulators dealing with utilities, third parties being engaged, is probably not going to be sufficient in the future to keep up with the fast pace of the industry changes. And I would also say the whole paradigm is going to shift. I think the position of the financial industry in this industry is going to change. I think the risk profiles will probably look different down the road at some point in time from utilities than they have in the past. So I think the whole industry is going to have to figure out how to work together in a new and different way. And we've talked about that in some panels at EEI in the past. But I think you're looking at fundamental changes in terms of how the fundamental players of this industry deal with each other, and whether it's a third party, whether it's a utility, whether it's a supplier like me, whether it's the financial community, the regulators, or whatever. It's going to look different in the future, and it's going to have to look different, and it's going to need to be a lot more nimble than it has been in the past. A lot more nimble.
Commissioner Johnson, I appreciate the question because you invite some criticism. But before I give the criticism, I want to give the compliment. And the compliment is, my advice is, follow through with this initiative that you've started since last year and continues for these next 2 weeks. Because what you're doing is one of the best examples globally and could put Ohio in front of every other market that exists today. And when I say globally, we have operations in Europe, Australia, Middle East, South America, all throughout North America, and this is one of the most genuine reflections of how markets could and should be designed. So I really appreciate being here, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing. Follow through. If I think about some criticism, hopefully, and I try to get this in my organization, that my organization knows what our vision and mission is. And I remember the first time that I met with all of you, and I was sitting in your lobby, and on your wall is your mission statement. I take exception with one word in your mission statement. Your mission statement says that you are trying to deliver customers competitive choice. When it comes to our industry, the electric industry, what choice is there really in a kilowatt hour? The challenge I have on choice is I think you really need to reflect on the word I used earlier, sovereignty. Customers want sovereignty from what we have been doing to them, not with them, to them for a long time. And what I mean by sovereignty is a good example of the dialogue today. I fall in the bucket that Rodger's been using called third party. Why are there utilities and third parties? I take offense to being called a third party.
That's right, I'm called a vendor.
Yeah. And why does that exist? Customers would never use that word, that there's a utility, a third party, and a vendor. And those are the ones I want you, public utility, to coordinate for me. They want sovereignty. So my criticism is reflect now that society has changed substantially, our industry has changed substantially. What is, one, the vision, and two, the true mission that exists in front of you exiting these 3 sessions of Power Forward?
Sure, Conley.
Thank you. Sayun, assume that we do follow through and we are able to facilitate grid modernization phases 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and as a result, we can give customers what they want, or customers can get what they want. And assume, Rodger, that we deploy the AMI and the other structures that allow for the procurement and the transmission, the storage of data, and the democratization of access to it. And David, assume that we also, as part of this, we upgrade the network with the facilities that you have in mind. I think you've used your Puerto Rico example as sort of a stark illustration of what any grid should aspire to be. We do all that, and we have a modernized grid. This is a question to each of the 3 of you. Do you see any new vulnerabilities that are established, created by doing all this, vulnerabilities to the reliable operation of the grid. And I understand, David, that the whole point of grid, well, one of the points of grid modernization is to actually make it more reliable and more resilient. But at the same time, do you think that we will encounter new types of vulnerabilities that we didn't used to have before we engaged in all the modernization activities? And what do you think we should do about them? Or do you think that we don't really need to be concerned about that because these modernization activities will, in fact, they will protect against reliability issues and won't cause any new ones? And what I'm thinking about is, as I'm listening to you, is that the grid that we are trying to improve, this modernized grid, it seems to me like it's going to be a more complex organism when we're done with it. And in my mind, increasing complexity for machines or systems, whatever it is, it typically it corresponds to new vulnerabilities, amplified vulnerabilities. So is it something we don't really need to be concerned about to a great degree, do you think, or are there certain things that we should be concerned about in that regard?
I think as we as we are seeking to modernize the grid, and let me explain what I mean in greater detail. The fact is, the grid is becoming more digitized, and so, as an example, the smart meter is a digital link between the utility and the customer, and they're going to be a broad array of new digital links. So when you can provide a broad array of new digital links and you rely on a platform, obviously cybersecurity is going to be a big issue. And so we have to figure out how we now, and you don't stop technology from evolving, but how do we address the cybersecurity issue? And it's a huge issue. Even with the 70 million smart meters that we've installed, we're now seeing that there are new vulnerabilities. Because as you digitize, you're creating a whole new pathway and access to the utility. We have functions in place to protect our energy management systems and our SCADA systems. There are issues where customers are going to be very concerned about the access to data that's flowing down in a common network. So yes, we do have some elements that we need to have some heightened concerns about, but we can deal with that. We can deal with it. I made a reference, and I don't want to have it misconstrued, that if you look at the federal level on cybersecurity, we have evolving rules that keep coming out from FERC. We have best practices at the state level. And much of our discussion today has not focused on the bulk power grid, it's focused on the distribution network. So I think we have to look at now, as we become more digitized, is there a better job that we can do in cybersecurity at the distribution level? And I think there are an array of approaches that could be used, but that's where I think is probably the most critical challenge that we have as we digitize more.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, no, I think you're right on target. You're going to create, obviously, the more actors you have, the more players you have, the more nodes you have to manage, you're going to introduce risk. There's just no doubt. And by the way, the way software is built around the globe is that, when you build software, it's a lot like building other things. Different companies actually contribute to the application build of any application. So there's third parties embedded in applications. So if you're buying a piece of software from a company, there are also third parties embedded in that software.
That's right.
And so to the extent you have more technology, you've got more actors, you have to have some sense of security and other things. What the industry needs, though, is a set of standards to run all this, whether it's a data center of some type, but all the technology that's going to be deployed at the grid. We need to settle on a set of standards that the industry is comfortable with in terms of requirements that technology suppliers need to be able to adhere to in order to try to minimize the risk where you can. So, you know, and I know the industry is working on those types of things, but having a set of standards across the industry that the third parties have to have the ability to adhere to, I think is going to be important as you modernize the grid, you add more technology. Every piece of technology you add, you've added a potential another avenue for a bad actor to get in and get inside your system. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. That's the way technology works. So you got to try to prevent that. And having a set of standards that meet the requirements, whether at the FERC level or an industry level set of standards, is going to be important to doing that. But there's no doubt that as you add the complexity that we've talked about, that clearly the risk profile is going to change from the old days of being a system that wasn't used by a lot of individual customers or others for that matter. So I think, you know, standards and paying closer attention to how software is actually built and having some understanding of how technology is actually built is going to be as important as understanding how you build power plants and how you string wire for transmission distribution systems or build transformers. It's interesting to note, in my old construction days, the nuclear business, we sent people out to look at how equipment was being assembled, whether it was a turbine or an NSSS system or a transformer, whatever it might be. I have to invite folks to come see how you build software. That may change in the future as standards are out there that have to be adhered to. But I think your point is well taken. You're going to introduce risk. You've got to make sure you can manage the risk.
I'm sorry, I'm a pie in the sky type guy, and if I unpack your question, I see two embedded questions. One, what does society get out of the vision the three of us articulated, and then what's at risk, and primarily cybersecurity, what you point out. I want to address that first part. What does society get? I'm very passionate about this topic, and I'll give you a very quick analogy. It's parking spaces. You might have seen this study. It's by an MIT professor that every single one of us in the United States, regardless of age, regardless if you drive or not, has 8 parking spaces available to him or her. And the average cost of a parking space, because there's above ground and below ground and surface parking, is about $8,000. So I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old at home, 2 kids. I have $64,000 invested, society has, in each one of them for parking spaces. And look at what we're doing with that money. Could we deploy that to something better for society than parking spaces for an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old? The same thing exists for us in the energy sector. And I go back to a point that Rodger made. It's one of the most critical infrastructure systems. It's the largest machine on Earth. And if you look at the US GDP growth and our efficiency in the United States, the past 10 years has been the most anemic, almost on record. But what we talk about today with optimizing infrastructure, imagine the efficiency we could bring to society in the amount of energy we consume to create the output we do as a nation. The economic opportunity globally, nationally, and in Ohio around this is phenomenal. I feel one of the single biggest contributors to get the U.S. back on a much more efficient growth frontier. And I view shame on us if we don't take advantage of trying to bring efficiency to society. Now, what's at stake? I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, nor will I ever be, but I feel that we are a very strong, intuitive nation that will figure out ways through those issues. But we have to start trying, and we are nowhere near the first industry to have to go through how do you provide security around both data and infrastructure. So we will find ways to do it, but we have to try.
So we have 5 or so minutes, so we'll do some rapid fire questions. Panelists, don't all feel like you have to opine upon the question, but we just want to make sure to get everyone's questions in. Howard, question.
I just want to follow up with...
Make sure you get a mic.
I just want to follow up on Sayun's points. First of all, we take seriously your request that that what the customers want is sovereignty. In fact, in the staff, we always refer to the customer being king, so that fits right in. But the most difficult question that we get is when we do that switch. The General Assembly has given the Commission the authority to declare areas to be competitive. And we can take them out of the, as you called it, the rent-seeking area and put it in the competitive. But the problem that we always run into is that when we do that, we have to decide what do we do with the investment that's already there. So, for example, you said, well, we'd like to do billing as something that we ought to be, that the competitive industry ought to be able to do. Right now, we have some pilot programs in on billing, but right now we also have the billing systems from the utilities built into base rates. What do we do if we open it up competitively with the investment that we have in base rates now?
So that's a super loaded question. Look, I'm going to give you the customer perspective, not my personal perspective. If I were a customer, what I would say about the rate base you created is actually, as a customer, that's mine. I own it. I put you in place to deploy it for me. So when we talk about investor-owned utilities, saying, I've already put this in my rate base and you owe me. Well, I can tell you in Belgium, where we have nuclear power plants, we faced this issue. And we own those nuclear power plants. They were rate-based. And that government said, these are actually the society's assets. And the game's over. I know that's a very tough thing to say. It's a lot of fireworks there. But I think we have to stop the snowball from continuing to roll. And no nice way to put it.
Questions from the staff? Yep, go ahead.
Rodger, this one's for you specifically. We look at AMI data. We've talked about data kind of generally today as power quality, demand, kW, and usage, that we have a lot more measurements with smart meters compared to analog. And then we have kind of this new category of, geocoded information on distributed energy resources or sensors and kind of what I consider utility type data. You mentioned future alternatives to AMI, but then also the need to deploy AMI. Could you just elaborate on what you meant by some of those future alternatives?
Yeah, and it's some of what we've talked about here today. So right now, AMI is clearly the best alternative to get that type of information, right? And it's valuable to both the customer as well as maintaining the distribution system for all the reasons you mentioned, right? Because I can see voltage changes. I can see what, if I'm leaning on particular substations from that information, where I might need to do maintenance if I'm on the utility side. If I'm on the customer side, I should be able to get information around my usage and some other things that I might do to change those patterns. Or if I need to call on customers, as we do in Baltimore, BG&E to change their patterns in a peak period where I know I might have some brownout issues. So that's today's environment. It's the best solution we have today. But to the sensor technology issue we talked about later, a meter today, if you looked at it, I have, the technology inside of a meter that really does what it needs to do is about the size of my wallet, right? It's not that much stuff. And essentially it does 320,000 data reads where the old meters did about 12. Well, that's still a huge restrictor point in terms of how we're going to interface with the customer, because all the sensor technology we talked about in previous presentations, you're going to have sensors on all your, and by the way, whether it's a homeowner or a business owner, sensors are going to be embedded in equipment in a home and equipment in a business. That data it might even be embedded in every outlet you have. But the sensor technology, sensors are cheap. They're going to be installed in every part of a home or a business, all the equipment that we use. Ultimately, you want to aggregate all that information to tell you, what's going on, not only just with consumption of electricity and where you're actually consuming it, but what's happening with that piece of equipment. Do I need to send that information out to an equipment supplier and say, hey, I need to do my maintenance sooner than I thought because of other issues? Well, the fact that the meter is just going to be a single point of information. You're going to have an aggregation device of some type. And I mean, today it could be a small computer. It could be embedded anywhere. And that information is going to be aggregated. All that sensor technology will be aggregated in a single location. And the question I think would be is then, who do you disperse that information to? Does it all go back to the utility? Are there other parties that might have access to that information? So today, we kind of neatly compartmentalize everything around AMI, which is a very limited use of technology in terms of what we're really going to learn from the customer. The larger the customer, the more information we'll be gathering because of sensor technology. And so that's what I mean when I say in the future. I really see there's going to be a time where AMI, just like other technology of the past, has been kind of a restrictor plate on what we can really do with the customer. If you believe sensor technology is going to be embedded in equipment in homes and businesses and other places, you'd want to aggregate that information. One of the small things it'll tell you is how much power you consumed, but all the other things it'll tell you is around the behaviors of a particular owner. It'll tell you about the behaviors of particular pieces of equipment, and that information is going to have a lot of value to someone. One would argue that if utilities are collecting it, it's a huge piece of information for them that has value. If it's regulated that other people ought to have access to that, it's going to have value to them as well. So that's what I mean when I say it's the best way today, but I think you can see in the not too distant future, the way we think about AMI today is a little bit restrictive, and the future is going to look much more different with some aggregation devices, and I think the question is going to be who has access to the information on those devices as sensor technology is more rapidly deployed within all of our customers. So that's what I mean. And that's what's going to make this more complex in terms of the data question, in terms of the complexity issues that we talked about, and who has the ability to provide the services associated with that. One could envision that the utilities would have the ability to provide information based on all that data. One could envision that other companies might want to have access to that information. And so I think that's where the real challenge is going to come. And by the way, I don't think it's that far away. The technology will be there today. We're restricting ourselves in this industry today to that environment. It's just kind of an artificial restriction. I hope that answers your question.
I have one more question, and it is loaded with traps. But this panel has been wonderful, reaffirming, inspiring, and I want I legitimately want your perspective on this as leaders in the industry. My fear, although we are trying to create a culture here at the commission and around the state of bringing the focus back to the customer, my fear is as we progress in this space and financial interests become center, my fear is we are going to pivot away from that. When grid mod proceeding that has pillars and attributes that are associated with trying to improve customers' lives, better the economy in Ohio, all these good things that I think can come out of this. When we actually, to Commissioner Johnson's point, when we actually start sitting down in hearing rooms and talking about who potentially gets to play where, what recovery will look like, what the ROE will look like, what investments go in rate base and what investments don't go in rate base, what a particular technology that has been invested in by a company and making sure that technology is proliferated, even if we're not clear it's going to provide betterment to customers. But the financial model of that entity is now built upon advancing that technology. I give you one of many potential sort of concerns and pitfalls as we proceed in this grid mod space. Outside of an answer of continue to try and push this culture of really focusing on the customer and the betterment of Ohioans' lives, any advice for this group, and there is a wonderful audience in the crowd that consists of utilities and retailers and folks from our environmental community and folks from the Ohio Consumers Council, and I look at them all and they look at each other very skeptically. So any advice that you can give the state of Ohio as we proceed down this path?
I'll go first.
Go ahead, please.
I think it's a tough thing to say, but there are business models that are no longer valid business models. And I think that my advice is you as a body of individuals needs to get out of the game of trying to pick winners and losers when it comes to providing that end energy outcome for customers. And that comes through market design, and it was mentioned earlier, good price formulation around the markets. And when you do that, you have to know that there are going to be economic models, primarily ones that are infrastructure focused, that are going to be damaged, those historical models. And we just have to move on as a society because, again, shame on us if we don't bring that efficiency forward that, as Rodger mentioned, already exists. We already have the technology to do a lot of what we talked about today. It's an artificial barrier as to why we haven't deployed it. And that artificial barrier is the mindset that the current industry veterans, me inclusive of that, and the current regulatory framework has put in place. So be brave and be willing to upset people.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just a couple comments. If you look around the world, there are folks who have gone after this exact question with great intent and positive hope for positive outcomes, but it hasn't worked out too well. Some of the countries I mentioned earlier, I think, are good examples of where they've struggled. And I always, try to stick with some of the basics. There is some science associated with this industry that you can't avoid, right? If you believe that serving kilowatt hours is one of the things we have to do well in this industry, and if you look at the model of generating a kilowatt hour, from the time you generate it to passing it through whatever system you're going to pass it through to get it to the customer, if you do that really, really, really effectively, there aren't that many mills in a kilowatt hour cost that you can play with to make everybody happy. And meaning every person who thinks they want to be in the industry or whatever. You got to be really mindful that you've got to stay in control of the ultimate price the consumer pays for the product generated in this industry, and that they're not penalized by some regulation that might cause that cost to go up in a way that it wouldn't normally go up. And I think if you look at the UK model, that might be one you want to take a look at. So I always look at the total price and say to myself, am I doing things that will help bring that price down, or am I doing things that might increase that price unnecessarily to customers? If you keep that kind of as one of the white lines on the side of the road, I think you come up with some specific answers. The other thing I would say is the obligation to serve is real. And some of the models we've come up with today in this country and other countries penalize those who can take advantage of some of those new technologies at least. And I think we have to keep that in mind as an industry. And that's another one of those white lines is, it is the difference between well-developed countries and those not as developed, that they make utilities available to all at rational prices that all can afford. And I think that's another thing, if you keep those kinds of things in mind. And then the last thing I would say is, keep the customer in mind. I don't think, I've never heard anybody in this industry say we're not out to serve our customers. I don't think that's the paradigm anymore. I mean, everybody seems to have the right intent. It's not like you're starting from scratch here in Ohio. You have a good system in place. You have good utilities. You've got other folks who want to do the right things for you. So you've got a good baseline to start with. I mean, your economy is good in this state. It's not true in all 50 states of this country. So the things you've done so far, don't beat yourself up too badly because they're working out pretty well for you. I mean, things are going decently well in the state of Ohio from an economic perspective, and I think a lot of that is the cooperation you've had with all the parties. So I think you're starting from a good baseline. But if you keep the ideas that, there are going to be some movers here. Technology is going to allow you to do things differently in the future than you have in the past. There's going to be a lot more information available. You got to figure out how to manage those types of things. We faced stranded asset issues in this industry before, with plants that couldn't get built. I remember in the early days of the IPP business when we had power plants being built in the wrong places because the folks who were out building them didn't understand that having load somewhat close to the to the source is an important thing in the economics of this business, and so there's stranded assets all over the place. I think if there's a good case to be made for a stranded asset, it's a stranded asset. But I would also tell you that you know, as long as you're making decisions in my mind that are beneficial to the customer, that don't differentiate and those that are less advantaged in terms of customers, if you keep in mind that you don't want to artificially inflate the cost of a kilowatt hour, normally you'll come up with conclusions that are pretty solid.
And I would only just, both of them gave excellent answers. Keep your eye on the prize. Your vision, as I would describe it, should be the customer. And what does the customer want? Customer wants reliable service. They want to be able to have service quickly restored if there's a disruption. The customer wants affordable service. And the customer, for the most part, and I think Rodger spoke to some of the large industrial and commercial customers that have sustainability goals. They want clean energy. For this to take place, clearly you need better price formation, Sayun said. You need a market that can evolve. But fundamental to all of that is a grid. And that's what I started when I concluded. I talked about Puerto Rico. I've observed all the dialogues that are taking place all across the country, even outside the United States, on the transformation of the industry. And there's one element that's always central to that. It's a robust grid. If you have a robust grid, all these other things will follow suit, in my view. And I think you're doing the right thing by having these dialogues, understanding a broad array of approaches, but focuses on the grid that will, in my view, spur economic development and innovation.
Everybody, please give our panelists a big round of applause. Okay, we are at a break. We ran over 15 minutes. The discussion was that fascinating. But let us, in fact, take a 15-minute break, and we'll reconvene at 11:15. Thank you.